We had a problem, but where others see problems, I see potential, specifically for crafting and DIY purposes. On the side of our house, a jasmine vine took over. It's so pretty when in bloom and smells amazing, but it just wasn't practical and was causing problems with the house. We've pruned back large sections over the years, but it's such a tangled mess, we can't even pull the pruned sections out because they're stuck within the growing plant. Last year, my mom decided she wanted it all gone. I volunteered to take it down so I could DIY some all-natural wreaths. In this video, I'll share the steps I took so you can make your own natural wreath too. As mentioned, I'm using jasmine vines for my wreaths, but any woody vine should work. Grape and muscadine vines are other great options. I think kudzu would work as well, but I haven't tested it because the small section of kudzu on our property is tangled with poison ivy. If you are personally harvesting vines and have already dried sections of the vines to remove, this can be made much easier by first hosing down the vines. When the vines are dry, they are brittle and can snap easily. We want our sections of vines to stay as long as possible because it makes the assembly much easier. So, soaking the vines can make it easier to remove as it gives the natural fiber a bit of pliability and flexibility. This step isn't as important if you're cutting down vines that are still alive, green, and supple. Now for the removal. Yeah, I have no advice for this other than it requires a good bit of physical labor and time. The vines I'm collecting are one giant tangled mess, so my strategy was to just hack off big chunks and try to pull them away from the main vine. I also discovered a couple of sweet gums growing within the jasmine, so that was less than ideal. Initially, I tried to untangle the vines as I went, but I gave up quickly on this futile effort. It was neat, though, to see how the vines impacted the way other plants grew. This oak that was hiding under the vines has these indents from where the jasmine wrapped around it. I think it's kind of cool. Once you've collected the vines, you need to separate the dried out vines from the still green vines. We can use the completely dried out vines now, but the green vines will need to dry out fully before they can be used. I had enough dried vines to make some wreaths, but the green vines I left out to dry. Those have been sitting outside since last fall, and you can see they dried out nice and brown. Now for the fun part, making the wreath. We will need a water source, a bucket to use as the frame of our wreath, the vines of course, and something to put the vines on so they aren't picking up grass and dirt from the yard. First, soak the vines thoroughly. Later, when the wreath is assembled, we'll let everything dry back out to get the finished wreath. If my sister watches this, she's going to give me a hard time about dry the wets, wet the dries, dry the wets. If you know the memes I'm talking about, that will make sense. Otherwise, this might sound like nonsense. Anyways, I put the damp vines into a bucket just to contain them and keep them clean. However, I don't recommend hosing them down once they're in the bucket because the bucket will fill with water, obviously, and become too heavy to move. Don't ask me how I know that. The reason we wet the vines is to make them pliable and not brittle. An easy way to test if they're wet enough is to bend them gently. If they snap, they're too dry. If they have some flex and bend, you should be good to go. I'll share more on this later. Now that my vines are wet and ready to work with, I found a long sturdy vine and cut off the side shoots. I'll use this section in a moment to wrap around the wreath and hold things in place. Then I need a bucket or round container. I like this gardening plant pot because of the size and the slight flexibility it has, but something like a 5-gallon bucket or a trash can could work too. I also used a giant tomato cage to make a larger wreath, but I never finished that one and it's been sitting on the driveway for the past year, looking kind of sad. The basic idea of assembly is we are going to wrap chunks of vine around whatever we are using for the frame, in my case, this plant pot. Then we will take the long section that we removed branches from and we'll wrap that around the wreath to hold it all together. This is a little easier to show than to explain in words. I find it's easiest to start by adding just a small section in the beginning. The setup is the hardest part, but once you've got a little bit of a foundation, it gets a lot easier. When you wrap the first chunk of vines around the frame, we're just going to loop around in a big circle, and if it overlaps, that's fine. And then when we get to the ends, we want to tuck the ends under the loop we've made so that it holds everything in place. Then grab another chunk of vines, wrap it around the pot, and tuck the ends under the wreath to hold it in place. There's really not a right or wrong way to do this. The main idea is to wrap sections around your frame and then tuck the ends under the loop you've created to hold it together. I've got a nice chunk of vines wrapped around my frame, I will grab that long piece from earlier and I'll wrap that around all the chunks of vine on my frame. Start by tucking one end under the wreath. Then wrap it around in a spiraling pattern to enclose around all the sections of vines on our frame. As a helpful tip, use the thickest, sturdiest end of the vine to feed under the wreath as you wrap. This way, it's less likely to break and easier to push under the wreath. This is also why I like using a flower pot because it has enough flex to help me get the wrapping piece between the wreath and the frame. We want to wrap all the way around the wreath. If your section of vine isn't long enough to go all the way around, that is totally fine. Just take another long section of vine, tuck one end under the wreath, and start wrapping around and around. When I'm adding a new section of the wrapping vine, sometimes I try to tuck the end under itself as I'm wrapping. Again, hard to explain in words, but hopefully you can see in the footage what I mean by wrapping it around itself. Anything I can do to hold the ends in securely is a great thing. As you go along, pieces might snap off or break occasionally. That is okay. Just tuck any ends into the wreath if you don't like the way they're sticking out. Also, once it's dry, we can trim anything off that we don't like. Now, we are going to repeat this process over and over. Wrap chunks of vine around the wreath, tuck in the ends as much as you're able. Then once you've added a bit of thickness, take a long section and wrap it all the way around the wreath. I like to pull things fairly tight and snug. Remember, our vines are wet right now, so they can be manipulated without breaking. When the vines dry back out, however, they will shrink up on themselves. So I like to pull everything nice and snug together so when it does dry out and shrink, it doesn't get weak and floppy. When weaving and working with natural fibers, one of the hardest aspects can be getting the vines the appropriate level of dampness. If they're not wet enough, the fibers will break and not be flexible enough to work with. However, if they're too damp, when it dries back out, the fibers will shrink so much away from each other that the end result is floppy and full of holes. The good news is, these wreaths are very forgiving in this regard. If you make the wreath really thick, that will help too because it will still have enough strength when dry even if the fibers shrink up a little bit. And if you wrap extra tightly, the shrinking will be hardly visible. You may want to wear gloves for working on this project. The vines can be a little bit rough on the hands, especially since I'm pulling everything so tightly. Also of note, it took me 15 minutes for the total assembly of my wreath. The prep of collecting the vines, drying them out, and soaking them was the longest part of the process for me. Of course, your mileage may vary, and my wreath isn't particularly large, but hopefully that gives you an idea of how much time you will need to set aside for this project. I would highly recommend making your wreath all in one go for best results. However, if you have to take a break and come back to making your wreath another day, all you need to do is re-soak the wreath that is already assembled, re-soak the vines you're going to work with, and then follow the same instructions as before to finish assembling your wreath. Once your wreath reaches the size and look you want, all you have to do is let it dry. I like to give mine several days outdoors so I know they are good and dried out. These are so beautiful just as is, and I love that it's an all-natural product. These will last a very long time, and when their usable life is over, they can return to nature and naturally break down. Of course, you don't have to stop here. I helped my sister assemble both a fall-themed wreath and a summery wreath. We used all natural materials that we had dried out. You can add the decor pieces in a variety of ways, including hot glue. To keep our wreaths all natural, we tucked the dried stems into the wreath directly, and if needed, we fastened them on with a piece of wire. While the wire itself won't decompose at the end of the wreath's life, it can be removed and used again. So I still count it as being an all-natural decor product. At this point, some of you might be thinking, can't I just buy a frame like this from the store? Sure, and they're not that expensive. But how fun is it to be able to say you made the entirety of the project yourself from natural materials? I love that this lets me customize the size of the wreath too, and I'm able to source my materials locally from nature. At the end of the day, the actual process of creating brings me a lot of joy, and there's worse ways I could spend my time. I hope this inspires you to make your own natural wreath. If you give this project a try, let me know in the comments how it goes, and be sure to tag me if you post a picture on Instagram so I can see your glorious creations. Happy crafting! Okay, you can like show it off or whatever you want to do. Oh my gosh, you're adorable. I love this. Okay, you're good.
Let me see it.